the Vikings, the real history behind the Longship legend. Asleep in Class. Welcome or welcome back to Asleep in Class, where we settle into long, quiet lectures about history, science, invention, civilization, and the strange paths of human knowledge. This episode follows the Vikings through the distance between sea legend and historical reality. We will move beyond the longship image into a world of farmers, raiders, traders, poets, kings, gods, runes, river routes, settlements, and changing power across the northern seas. This is a calm journey through the real history behind one of the most enduring warrior and explorer legends ever created, before the Longship became a legend. Before the Longship became the great symbol of the Viking Age, the northern world was already shaped by sea, weather, wood, iron, kinship, farms, and memory. The people later called Vikings did not begin as a single nation and did not think of themselves by that modern label in the way later history would. They came from regions that now belong mostly to Denmark, Norway, and Sweden. But their world was made of local communities, powerful families, chieftains, farmers, sailors, craftsmen, poets, traders, and warriors who lived around cold coasts, fjords, islands, forests, river mouths, and inland farms. The word Viking itself is complicated. In historical use, it could refer to raiding or seafaring activity rather than to every person from Scandinavia. Not everyone in the Norse world was a raider. Many people spent their lives farming, fishing, weaving, raising animals, building houses, making tools, trading goods, settling land, and managing households. The modern habit of calling all early medieval Scandinavians Vikings can hide that wider society. Viking was something some people did, not simply everything they were. The Viking Age is often dated from the late 8th century to the 11th century. A famous symbolic beginning is the attack on the monastery of Lindisfarne in 793, recorded with shock by writers in the Christian world. The raid mattered because it struck a sacred and relatively exposed place, and because written sources from monasteries preserved the fear and outrage of those who experienced such attacks. But the raid did not come from nowhere. Scandinavian seafarers already knew how to move along coasts and across open water. What changed was the scale, reach, and recorded impact of their activity. The northern environment encouraged movement. Much of Scandinavia contained limited farmland, harsh winters, difficult terrain, and long coastlines. The sea could be a barrier, but it could also be a road. Boats connected communities more easily than land routes in many places. A skilled crew could move between islands, rivers, trading sites, and foreign coasts. The Longship became famous because it suited this world: fast, flexible, shallow drafted, and capable of both open sea travel and river movement. The Longship was not a magical object, but it was a brilliant piece of practical design. Built with overlapping planks in the clinker style, using timber, iron rivets, woolen sails, oars, and careful craftsmanship, it could move with speed and surprising versatility. Its shallow draft allowed it to approach beaches, enter rivers, and strike where larger ships could not easily follow. A longship could carry warriors, but it could also carry goods, news, settlers, and ambitions. It turned geography into opportunity. The ship also depended on an entire society behind it. Someone had to fell trees, shape planks, forge rivets, twist rope, weave sailcloth, raise sheep for wool, preserve tar, train crews, and pass down navigational knowledge. The longship that appears in legend as a dragon-headed vessel cutting through mist was also the product of farms, forests, workshops, and households. A sail at sea began long before it reached the shore. The early medieval Scandinavian household was central to social life. People lived in farms and settlements where extended families, dependents, enslaved people, hired workers, and animals formed a working unit. Longhouses sheltered people through cold seasons and gathered labor around hearths, storage, food preparation, craft, and storytelling. Wealth might be measured in land, livestock, silver, ships, weapons, textiles, and reputation. Honor mattered, but so did hay, grain, iron, and winter survival. Social status varied widely. Some people were powerful chieftains or kings. Some were free farmers with rights and obligations. Some were landless dependents. Some were enslaved, captured in raids, or born into servitude. The Viking world cannot be honestly described without slavery. Enslaved people worked in households, farms, and trade networks, and they could be bought and sold. The same voyages that carried silver and furs could also carry human beings as property. Scandinavian society was not isolated from the rest of Europe before the raids became famous. Trade goods, ideas, weapons, coins, and luxury objects moved through northern routes. Franks, Anglo-Saxons, Irish, Slavs, Finnic peoples, Sami communities, Baltic peoples, Byzantines, Arabs, and others all belonged to the wider horizon of Norse activity, directly or indirectly. The northern world was not an edge of history. It was part of a connected early medieval landscape. Religion shaped how people understood fate, death, honor, and the world beyond human farms. Before Christian conversion, many Scandinavians honored gods such as Odin, Thor, Freya, and Freyja, along with spirits, ancestors, and local sacred powers. Their beliefs were not written down by pagan priests in a single sacred book. So much of what survives comes from later Christian-era texts, poetry, archaeology, place names, and comparative study. That means caution is necessary. The Norse mythic world is rich, but the evidence is layered and partly filtered through later memory. The earliest raiders who frightened monasteries were not horned helmet caricatures. The horned helmet is a modern fantasy and stage image, not a normal Viking Age battle helmet. Real warriors used helmets when they could: shields, spears, axes, swords, bows, and mail armor if wealthy enough. Many weapons were practical tools of war and status. A sword could be an heirloom. An axe could be both ordinary and deadly. A shield wall could matter more than the individual duel imagined by later romance. What made Viking activity so powerful was the combination of maritime skill, opportunism, political fragmentation, and economic hunger. Coastal monasteries and towns often had wealth and limited defenses. Rivers opened routes into the interior. Silver, captives, livestock, and portable goods could be seized. But raiding was only one strategy. The same seafaring world could trade at one coast, raid another, demand tribute from a third, and settle land at a fourth. The longship became a legend because it was the visible shape of northern mobility. It carried fear to monasteries, trade to markets, settlers to islands, warriors to kingdoms, and stories back to halls. Yet behind the ship stood a society much broader than raiding. To understand the Vikings, we have to begin before the symbol hardened into myth. We have to see the farms behind the warriors, the craftsmen behind the ships, the households behind the voyages, and the northern world that learned to make the sea its road. Raiders, traders, farmers, and kings. The Vikings are remembered most vividly as raiders, but raiding was only one part of a wider pattern of movement. A Norse crew could steal, trade, settle, serve as mercenaries, collect tribute, or make alliances, depending on circumstance. The same ship might carry warriors one season and merchants another. The same leader might raid a monastery, bargain with a king, marry into a local family, and later rule land. Viking activity was flexible because the early medieval world itself was flexible, full of weak borders, rival rulers, exposed wealth, and opportunities for men who could move quickly. Raids were often designed for speed and shock. A ship could appear near a coast or river settlement with little warning. Warriors could land, strike, seize portable wealth, capture people, burn buildings, and leave before a serious defense gathered. Monasteries were attractive targets because they could hold precious metalwork, books, livestock, food stores, and people, while often lacking military protection. To Christian writers, attacks on sacred places seemed especially horrifying. To raiders, such places could look like concentrated wealth in vulnerable buildings. The fear created by raids sometimes became more profitable than the raids themselves. Rulers and communities paid tribute to avoid destruction. In the Frankish world, large payments were made to Viking armies to leave or redirect their violence. In England, later payments, sometimes called Danegeld, became part of the political landscape. Tribute was not a sign of cowardice alone. It could be a practical choice when military response was difficult, or when buying time was cheaper than losing towns. Trading required different skills, but often used the same networks. Scandinavian merchants carried furs, wax, honey, amber, walrus ivory, iron, soapstone, textiles, and enslaved people. They sought silver, silk, glass, spices, wine, weapons, and luxury goods. Trading sites such as Hedeby, Birka, Koppang, and Dublin became important centers where goods, languages, and cultures met. These places were not peaceful utopias, but they show that the Viking world was commercial as well as violent. Silver became especially important. Much of the silver found in Viking Age hoards came from Islamic coins, known as dirhams, which traveled through eastern trade routes into Scandinavia. Sometimes the coins were valued less as currency, with a fixed political meaning, and more as silver by weight. Cut pieces of silver, arm rings, ingots, and coins formed a bullion economy. The presence of Arabic silver in northern hoards shows how far Viking Age connections could reach. Most Scandinavians, however, lived by farming. They raised cattle, sheep, goats, pigs, and horses, grew barley, oats, rye, and other crops where conditions allowed, cut hay, fished, hunted, gathered, and managed seasonal labor. The farm was the economic foundation of the Viking world. Even men who went raiding often came from farming households. The romantic warrior at sea depended on people at home storing food, tending animals, making cloth, and keeping the household alive. Women played central roles in this world. They managed households, textile production, food storage, family alliances, property in some circumstances, and the daily survival of farms. Grave evidence and sagas suggest that elite women could hold status and authority, though the details varied by region and period. Women were not simply waiting figures in the background of male adventure. The Viking household required their labor, skill, and decision-making. Some women traveled, settled abroad, and helped establish Norse communities in new lands. Political organization changed during the Viking Age. In earlier periods, power was often local and regional, centered on chieftains, jarls, and petty kings. Over time, larger kingdoms developed in Denmark, Norway, and Sweden, though the process was uneven and contested. Leaders gained power through warfare, alliances, gift-giving, control of trade, religious patronage, and the ability to attract followers. A king had to be more than a title. He had to reward men, command ships, and survive rivals. Gift-giving was one of the foundations of lordship. A powerful leader distributed rings, weapons, feasts, land, and plunder to maintain loyalty. The hall was an important symbol of this relationship. In the firelit space of the hall, men drank, listened to poetry, received gifts, heard news, and reinforced bonds of service and reputation. The hall was both social and political. It was where memory, hierarchy, and ambition were performed. Poets, known as skalds, helped preserve and shape reputations. A ruler wanted deeds remembered in verse. Poetry could praise generosity, victory, courage, and lineage. Skaldic poetry was often complex, dense, and formal, full of kennings and references that required cultural knowledge. In a world where fame mattered, the poet had power. A leader who won battles but was forgotten had lost part of victory. Words could carry a name farther than ships. Raiding armies sometimes became settlement forces. In England, Scandinavian armies moved from seasonal raiding into conquest and settlement. The so-called Great Heathen Army arrived in the 9th century and changed the political map of Anglo-Saxon England. Areas under Scandinavian influence became known later as the Danelaw, where Norse legal and cultural influence mixed with existing English society. The line between raider and settler could become permanent as families, farms, and towns followed war. In Ireland, Norse activity helped create and develop port towns such as Dublin, which became a major center of trade, slavery, and power. Vikings raided monasteries and settlements, but also became part of Irish political struggles, sometimes fighting against and alongside local rulers. Over time, Norse and Gaelic worlds interacted, intermarried, competed, and blended. Viking history in Ireland is therefore not just a story of foreign attack. It is a story of settlement and cultural entanglement. In Normandy, Scandinavian settlers under leaders such as Rollo received land from the Frankish king in the early 10th century, creating a duchy whose people became known as Normans. They adopted the French language and Christianity over time, but retained a memory of northern origin and a strong military aristocracy. In 1066, the Norman conquest of England under William, the Conqueror linked a Viking-descended polity to one of the most famous turning points in English history. The Viking Age did not end neatly at the shoreline. The image of Vikings as wild destroyers is therefore incomplete. They were raiders, but also traders. They were farmers, but also explorers. They were pagans, then increasingly Christians. They were outsiders in some lands and founders of towns in others. They were feared by monks, hired by emperors, resisted by kings, absorbed by local societies, and remembered by descendants who often changed the story. The Viking world was built on motion and adaptation. A man could seek silver abroad and return to buy land. A family could settle across the sea and become part of a new community. A chieftain could become a king if he gathered enough wealth, followers, and sacred legitimacy. A raider could become a ruler. The Longship opened the road, but the choices made after landing determined whether the story became plunder, trade, settlement, or kingdom. Gods, runes, halls, and the northern world. The Viking world was not only a world of ships and raids, it was also a world of stories, gods, runes, halls, graves, laws, feasts, crafts, and sacred landscapes. To understand why the Viking image remains so powerful, we have to enter the mental world that surrounded the voyages. The people of Scandinavia did not sail through empty space. They moved through a universe filled with divine powers, fate, ancestors, omens, honor, poetry, and memory. The Norse gods known today come to us through complicated sources. Odin, Thor, Freya, Freyja, Loki, Tyr, and other figures appear in medieval texts, poetry, place names, art, and archaeology. Many of the fullest mythological accounts were written down in Iceland after Christianization, especially in the Poetic Edda and the Prose Edda. These sources preserve extraordinary material, but they are not simple pagan scripture recorded unchanged from the Viking Age. They are layered, literary, and shaped by later context. Odin was associated with wisdom, poetry, war, death, and kingship. Thor was associated with thunder, strength, protection, and the defense of gods and humans against giants. Freya and Freyja had connections with fertility, prosperity, desire, magic, and status. Loki appears as a complex and dangerous figure, a trickster whose actions lead toward catastrophe. The mythic world was not tidy. It was full of bargains, betrayals, transformations, monsters, doomed knowledge, and the shadow of Ragnarök, the destruction and renewal of the world. Fate mattered deeply in Norse literature. People could act bravely and still be doomed. A hero's greatness often came not from escaping death, but from facing it with courage and reputation intact. This does not mean every Viking Age person walked around thinking like a saga hero, but the literature preserves a culture fascinated by honor under pressure. The question was not always how to live forever. It was how to be remembered after death. Runes belonged to writing, memory, and power. The runic alphabet was used for inscriptions on stones, wood, metal, bone, and other materials. Rune stones could commemorate the dead, mark inheritance, proclaim bridge building, name travelers, or announce Christian faith in later periods. They were not long books in the way manuscripts were, but public statements in carved form. A runestone could place a person's name in the landscape, making memory visible. Some runic inscriptions are brief and practical. Others are poetic, memorial, or mysterious. The modern imagination often treats runes as purely magical symbols, but historically, they were also a writing system used for ordinary and commemorative purposes. Their power came partly from inscription itself, the act of cutting language into durable material. A carved name could resist forgetting. In a world where memory and reputation mattered, that was already a kind of power. The hall was another center of meaning. A great hall gathered people around fire, food, drink, poetry, law, gifts, and authority. It could be the place where a chieftain displayed generosity, where warriors received rewards, where marriages were arranged, where disputes were discussed, and where stories were told through long winter nights. The hall was warm in a cold world, but it was also political. To sit close to the high seat, to receive a ring, to be named in verse, to belong to the Lord's following. These were social facts. Feasting reinforced hierarchy. A generous lord fed followers and guests. A respected warrior accepted gifts and gave loyalty. Hospitality mattered, but it was not simple kindness. It created obligation. The exchange of food, drink, weapons, rings, and words made relationships visible. A poor leader could not keep followers. A stingy ruler invited contempt. Generosity was not separate from power. It was one of power's languages. Craftsmanship shaped the beauty of the Viking world. Metalworkers made brooches, swords, fittings, keys, scales, weights, and ornaments. Woodcarvers decorated ships, buildings, sledges, and everyday objects. Textile workers produced sails, clothing, tapestries, and household goods. The surviving art styles of the Viking Age feature gripping beasts, interlaced forms, serpents, birds, and animals woven into dense patterns. The visual world of the Vikings was not crude. It was intricate, skilled, and symbolically rich. Burial practices varied by region, status, and period. Some people were cremated. Others were buried in mounds, graves, boats, or chambers with goods such as weapons, tools, jewelry, animals, and household objects. Ship burials, especially the great elite examples known from places such as Oseberg and Gokstad, have had a powerful effect on modern imagination. A ship in a grave suggests voyage, status, and the linking of life, death, and movement. But such burials were exceptional, not everyday practice for all. Law also mattered in the northern world. Assemblies, often called things, provided spaces where free people could resolve disputes, make decisions, hear laws, and negotiate power. These assemblies were not modern democracies, and influence depended heavily on status, wealth, gender, and force. But they show that Viking Age society was not simply ruled by random violence. Law, feud, compensation, exile, and arbitration all helped organize conflict. Violence existed alongside procedure. Feud was a serious social force. Injury to one person could involve a whole family or following. Compensation might settle a killing, but revenge could continue cycles of violence. Honor required response, but survival required negotiation. The sagas, written later, but drawing on remembered social patterns, often explore this tension between pride, law, kinship, and doom. A society can value courage and still fear the consequences of endless revenge. Christianity gradually transformed the Viking world. Conversion did not happen everywhere at once. Missionaries, kings, traders, captives, marriages, politics, and contact with Christian lands all played roles. Some rulers adopted Christianity as part of state formation and international legitimacy. Old beliefs did not vanish overnight. For generations, symbols and practices overlapped. A runestone might use older forms while proclaiming Christian faith. The religious transition was both spiritual and political. The northern world was therefore not a simple pagan battlefield waiting to become Christian Europe. It was a complex society with its own systems of meaning. Its people told stories about gods and heroes, carved names into stone, gathered in halls, held assemblies, made beautiful objects, honored the dead, fought feuds, converted slowly, and carried memory across seas. The Viking myth survives because this world gave it depth. Behind the raider stood a universe of words, rituals, objects, and fears. When the Longship leaves the shore in imagination, it carries more than warriors. It carries a carved prow, a woven sail, a household's labor, a poet's hope for fame, a god's name, a dead ancestor's memory, a legal claim, a hunger for silver, and the knowledge that the sea can erase everything. That is why the Viking image has lasted. It belongs not only to violence, but to a whole northern way of facing distance, danger, and time. Rivers, empires, and the road to the east. The Viking world did not only face west toward monasteries, islands, and Atlantic coasts. It also turned east into rivers, forests, trading routes, steppe corridors, and empires whose wealth and scale were astonishing to northern travelers. The eastern routes show a different side of Viking activity. Here the Longship was not only a raiding vessel crossing open sea. It became a river craft, a carrier of furs, wax, slaves, silver, warriors, and ambition moving between the Baltic, the rivers of Eastern Europe, the Black Sea, the Caspian, Byzantium, and the Islamic world. Scandinavians who traveled east are often associated with the names Rus, Varangians, or other terms depending on source and context. The origins and meanings of these names are complex and debated, but the historical reality is clear enough. Groups from the Scandinavian world played important roles in trade, warfare, and political formation along eastern river routes. They did not move through empty land. They encountered and interacted with Slavic, Finnic, Baltic, Turkic, Byzantine, and Islamic societies, among others. Rivers were the highways of the eastern Viking world. Routes connected the Baltic Sea to river systems such as the Dnieper and Volga, leading toward the Black Sea and Caspian regions. Travel was difficult. Crews had to row, sail where possible, portage ships overland, face rapids, pay tribute, negotiate with local powers, and defend themselves. The journey to Byzantium, or the Islamic world, was not a casual voyage. It required organization, endurance, and knowledge of many landscapes. Trade goods from the north and forest zones were valuable abroad. Furs, wax, honey, amber, swords, walrus ivory, and enslaved people could move south and east. In return came silver, silk, spices, glass, wine, jewelry, and other luxury goods. The great quantities of Islamic silver coins found in Scandinavia show how important these routes became. Coin minted far away could end its journey in a northern hoard, cut into pieces, and weighed as bullion. The slave trade was a major and brutal part of this economy. People captured in raids or warfare could be sold across long distances. The movement of enslaved people through eastern routes connected Viking activity to wider markets in the Islamic world and Byzantium. Any calm history of the Vikings must include this fact. The same networks that carried silver and silk also carried human suffering. Viking mobility was impressive, but it was not innocent. The city of Constantinople, capital of the Byzantine Empire, held immense attraction. To northern travelers, it was a city of walls, churches, palaces, markets, gold, ceremony, and imperial power on a scale far beyond most Scandinavian settlements. Norse sources later called it Miklagard, the great city. It stood as one of the richest and most sophisticated urban centers of the medieval world. To reach it was to enter a world of marble, mosaics, bureaucracy, diplomacy, and danger. The Varangian Guard became one of the most famous Eastern connections. Scandinavian and later Anglo-Saxon warriors served as elite guards for Byzantine emperors. They were valued for martial skill, and sometimes for their foreignness, which could make them personally loyal to the emperor rather than local factions. Service in Byzantium offered pay, prestige, and exposure to a world very different from the northern halls. Some men returned home with wealth and stories. Others vanished into imperial service. The eastern routes also contributed to the formation of early Rus polities, including centers such as Novgorod and Kiev. The relationship between Scandinavian elites and local Slavic populations was complex and has been politically sensitive in modern interpretations. The best approach is to avoid making the story either purely Scandinavian or purely local. Early ruse society emerged from interaction, adaptation, trade, tribute, warfare, marriage, and state formation across a mixed region. Vikings were part of the story, not the whole story. Arabic writers provide some of the most vivid outside descriptions of northern traders. Ahmed ibn Fadlan, who encountered ruse traders near the Volga in the 10th century, left a famous account describing their appearance, customs, and a ship burial. His writing is invaluable, but it is also the view of an outsider with his own cultural assumptions. Like all sources, it must be read carefully. Still, it gives us one of the clearest glimpses of how startling Norse travelers could appear to people from other worlds. The eastward Viking roots show that the Viking Age was part of global medieval history. A silver coin from the Islamic Caliphate, a silk from Byzantium, a sword blade from Frankish workshops, a fir from northern forests, and a rune carved in Scandinavia could all belong to the same network. The northern world was not sealed off in ice. It was tied to economies reaching across continents. These connections also changed Scandinavia itself. Imported silver altered wealth and status. Foreign goods became signs of prestige. Returning travelers brought stories of cities, armies, religions, and rulers. Christianity entered Scandinavia partly through contact with Christian lands east and west. Political ambition grew in a world where kings could compare themselves with foreign monarchs, and where wealth from abroad could support followers at home. The Viking Age expansion to Iceland, Greenland, and briefly North America shows another direction of movement. Norse settlers reached Iceland in the late 9th century, then Greenland, and around the year 1000 established a short-lived presence at Elant's Ox Meadows in Newfoundland. These voyages reveal extraordinary maritime skill. They also reveal limits. Settlement required more than arrival. Climate, supply, conflict, distance, and resources all mattered. Not every voyage became a lasting colony. The road to the east, like the road west, was made of opportunity and risk. A crew might gain silver, service, trade contacts, and fame. It might also drown in a river, die of disease, be killed by enemies, or disappear in a foreign city. The Viking world rewarded mobility, but punished failure. Every route carried both wealth and grave danger. The Eastern story matters because it frees the Vikings from a narrow image of raiders attacking Western monasteries. They were also merchants on river systems, mercenaries in imperial guards, settlers in mixed frontier towns, tribute collectors, slavers, explorers, and political actors in regions far from the Atlantic. The Longship legend is incomplete without the rivers. The sea road became a river road, and the river road led to empires. When we imagine a Viking vessel now, we often place it beneath a stormy northern sky. But another image belongs beside it. A ship being dragged past rapids on an eastern river, men straining over ropes, cargo guarded, silver hoped for, foreign languages ahead, and the rumor of a great city somewhere beyond the water. The Viking Age was not only a northern story, it was a story of movement across the connected medieval world. The end of the Viking Age and the life of the myth. The Viking Age did not end because Scandinavian people disappeared or because the northern seas became quiet all at once. It ended because the conditions that had made Viking raiding, expansion, and independent sea power so effective gradually changed. Kingdoms became stronger. Christianity reshaped political life. Fortifications improved. Naval defenses developed. Scandinavian rulers themselves became part of the Christian monarchic world. The raider, trader, settler, and sea king were absorbed into new forms of power. In England, resistance to Viking armies helped shape stronger kingship over time. Alfred the Great of Wessex and his successors developed defenses, fortified settlements, military organization, and political strategies that made raiding harder and conquest more complex. Scandinavian settlers became part of English society in many regions. Norse influence remained in place names, language, law, and ancestry. But the age of unchecked raiding was increasingly met by organized response. The reign of Sinutt in the early 11th century shows how far the Viking world had changed. Sinutt ruled a North Sea empire that included England, Denmark, and Norway for a time. He was not simply a raider who took loot and left. He was a Christian king ruling through established institutions, law, taxation, church patronage, and diplomacy. His career shows the transformation of Viking power into royal power. The ship had led to the throne, the traditional symbolic end of the Viking Age in England is often placed in 1066, when Harald Hardrada of Norway invaded and was defeated by Harold Godwinson at the Battle of Stamford Bridge. Soon afterward, William of Normandy defeated Harold at Hastings. Both invasions belonged to worlds shaped by Viking expansion. Harold as a Norwegian king, with a career reaching into the east. William as Duke of a Viking-descended Norman polity. The year 1066 did not erase Norse influence. It marked the passing of one age into another. Christianization changed the northern world deeply. Kings used Christianity to strengthen rule, connect with European monarchies, support written administration, and reshape sacred authority. Churches, bishops, monasteries, and Latin literacy became increasingly important. Old gods did not vanish immediately from memory, and pre-Christian stories survived in altered forms, especially in Icelandic literature. But the public religious structure of Scandinavia changed. The world of Thor's hammer gradually gave way to the world of the cross. State formation also mattered. As Denmark, Norway, and Sweden became more organized kingdoms, independent raiding became less acceptable or less useful. Kings wanted to control violence, taxation, trade, and foreign relations. A ruler who wished to be recognized among Christian monarchs could not allow every ambitious crew to raid wherever it pleased. The same northern energy that had once produced sea raiders now supported royal fleets, church building, law codes, towns, and dynastic politics. Economic change reduced some incentives for raiding. Trade networks became more regulated. Towns grew. Coinage, taxation, and royal authority developed. Raiding did not disappear from the medieval world, but the specific Viking age pattern weakened. Men who once might have sought wealth through seasonal raiding could serve kings, trade, farm, join crusades, or enter other forms of military life. Violence remained, but its organization changed. The memory of the Vikings survived most richly in Icelandic sagas and poetry, written down in the Christian Middle Ages, but preserving stories of earlier families, voyages, feuds, gods, and heroes. These texts are not simple transcripts of Viking Age reality. They are literary works shaped by memory, art, politics, and later values. Yet they preserve names, social patterns, emotional worlds, and narrative structures that continue to define how the Viking past is imagined. The sagas often show people trapped by honor, law, kinship, and fate. They are not only adventure stories, they are studies of human conflict in small societies where reputation can be deadly. A careless insult, a disputed inheritance, a failed marriage alliance, or an act of revenge can unfold into tragedy. This literary inheritance gives the Viking myth unusual psychological depth. The raider becomes part of a wider world of law, speech, pride, and consequence. Modern Viking imagery has gone through many transformations. Romantic nationalism in the 19th century reshaped Vikings into symbols of ancient northern strength. Operas, paintings, poems, and popular histories added drama. Horned helmet, now one of the most recognizable fake Viking images, came largely from modern costume and theatrical tradition, rather than Viking Age evidence. Modern culture often remembers the symbol more easily than the correction. The 20th and 21st centuries have continued to remake the Vikings through novels, films, television, games, music, festivals, and reenactment. Sometimes these works capture real features: ships, trade, settlements, poetry, law, and social complexity. Sometimes they exaggerate violence, ignore slavery, simplify religion, or turn history into fantasy. The Viking image is flexible because it can be made into many things: explorer, barbarian, pagan hero, trader, settler, rebel, king, or doomed warrior. Archaeology has steadily deepened the picture. Excavations of ships, burials, towns, hoards, houses, tools, textiles, weapons, and settlements have moved the Vikings beyond written fear. Places such as Oseberg, Gokstad, Birka, Hedeby, Jorvik, Dublin, and Elance, Ox Meadows, reveal different parts of the world behind the legend. Archaeology shows women's work, craft production, trade, diet, disease, migration, and daily life. It gives the Viking Age back its material reality. The myth persists because the Vikings sit at a crossroads of fear and freedom. They came from the edge of the known world for many Christian writers, appeared suddenly from the sea, violated sacred spaces, carried strange gods, and left behind stories of ships and flame. But they also settled, traded, governed, converted, married, farmed, and became ancestors. The contradiction makes them powerful. They are both outsiders and founders. A historically honest Viking story must hold several truths together. Vikings could be terrifying raiders. Scandinavian societies were also farming societies. Norse traders connected the north to the Islamic world and Byzantium. Viking crews practiced forms of shipboard and household hierarchy that were not modern equality. Enslavement was central to their economy. Women were essential to settlement and household power. Christianity did not simply erase the past, but transformed it. Longship was real, and so was the myth that grew around it. The end of the Viking Age was therefore not the sinking of a final ship. It was the transformation of a world. The raider became a king's man. The chieftain became part of a kingdom. The pagan shrine gave way to the church. The trading camp became a town. The saga turned memory into literature. The longship remained in the mind long after the political conditions that made it feared had changed. And so the Vikings remain with us as a layered image, a sail on a gray horizon, a hall glowing in winter, a rune stone beside a road, a silver hoard buried in the ground, a ship under a burial mound, a monk writing fear into a chronicle, a trader weighing coins from a distant caliphate, a settler watching the shore of Iceland rise from the sea, a king turning raiding power into law. The real history behind the Longship legend is not smaller than the myth. It is larger. It contains violence, craft, poetry, law, slavery, exploration, faith, ambition, settlement, and memory. The Vikings were never only one thing, and that is why they have never disappeared. They passed out of the age that made them, but the image of the ship still moves through history, carrying the northern world behind it.